Alright, we will try this again. Oh my gosh, we have sound. I amaze myself sometimes. Well, let's see if anyone shows up here. Oh, we have a like. How did that happen? Interesting. Well, I guess I may as well get started. And I may as well get started by pointing behind my head at this lovely illustration. This is an original inking. I suppose I can take this off because it's not like I'm going to be hearing anything. That was done for me by an excellent Polish ink artist named Suweren Jasinski. And anyone who looked at the thumbnail of this video will have seen a second one, a portion of which is in the text pages of the book that I would like to talk about, which was just published on Amazon today. It is available in the very top of the description box and is called The Hero and the Man. It is about the equivalent, the closest thing I have to a Bible, which is Homer. I'm speaking, of course, of the Iliad and the Odyssey, not the donut-eating yellow man that we are tragically more familiar with in our culture today. So someone pointed out the humor of that in recently. They said, imagine being such a great artist that people, remember you 2,800, 3,000 years after your work is done as the greatest artist of all time, and you're still the second most well-known Homer in America anyways. So anyways, enough with the digressions. The book is, well, as the title would imply, about heroism and about what it means to be a man, and specifically in the contexts of Homer's epics. For those of you who don't know, who haven't read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I would strongly recommend you do, and if you aren't familiar with it at all, I would pause this video and go to Lindy Beige's YouTube channel. Old school OG YouTuber, excellent content creator on all kinds of subjects: military history, forestry, film, weapons, all kinds of interesting stuff. He gave a great little 8-minute introductory video called What is the Iliad About? And it dispels a lot of illusions that people have about the Iliad that they get from movies like Troy, which is only peripherally related to the Iliad. It's a different storyline, essentially. It covers some of the same stuff, but it's its own piece. Anyways, I'm getting distracted again. There are many frames you could use to look at this book, to look at the Iliad. The frame that I approached it with in my book, which I think is one of the major themes and frames with which the book should be approached, is what it means to be a hero. The Iliad is fundamentally about heroism, among other things. It describes heroes in an age of heroes, we might say. It has this ancient golden age feel to it. This was the time of Achilles. All these great warriors like Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon went to war with Hector and Paris and old King Priam. These are well-known names that we're all familiar with, and it has this rosy, romantic hue because they're so memorable. And we look back fondly on those times because they give us a sense of cohesion in the present, which is something other commentators have talked about. And it happens to tie in with one of the themes of what it means to be a hero according to Homer. Because Homer fundamentally changed what it meant to be a hero. Prior to Homer, in the say, the Proto-Indo-European speaking world. We're talking 5,000, 6,000 BC. Ancient world. Hero was a word, roughly speaking, and it meant something like protector or guardian. The oldest epic poetic phrase in the Proto-Indo-European vernacular was, he killed the dragon. Or sometimes the theme is, as Calvert Watkins says, hero slay dragon, or hero slay serpent. It's very, happens in the Indic poems. It happens in many of the Latin epics in different ways. And we see echoes of that in the Greek as well, though interestingly enough, not in Homer. We see it more in the story of Hercules, who is in many ways a competitor with Achilles for the title of most thematically complete hero, though Achilles fills in a bunch of other niches that Heracles maybe does less completely. But that's the pre-Homeric world. What does Homer do with it? Well, Homer depicts heroism as a pursuit of glory. And this glory, kleos, is not just fame or renown, although it is that. It is also attached to the medium by which this renown and fame is preserved and spread, and that is song and poetry. Will you ghostwrite my book about how Santa's reindeer learned to fly? That sounds like a killer short story and a ghost story. Could be fun. Santa is another interesting example of a hero, maybe a subject for another time, not addressed in my book. But we have a Santa is one of the few remaining hero cults in the modern world. Anyways, what Homer does to the hero is he changes him from merely being a protector to someone who is pursuing immortality through song and through story. It changes their view of the world and also their view of language. A contemporary example. My wife and I were watching Lord of the Rings a few days ago, and Sam has this line where he's asking Frodo, Frodo, do you think they'll sing songs about us? Do you think they'll tell stories about us? Oh, those brave Sam and fearless Frodo taking the ring to Mordor and all that. And it's a very cute and pleasant little moment in an otherwise dark and very kind of despairing context, which maybe gives some hint at the value of this heroic mindset in a world where one might feel despairing, which is addressed in the book. But it changes the purpose, and it changes the role of the hero. Homer does. And what's funny is that these books themselves are that medium. They are the medium that is describing the way by which the medium can lead to immortality if someone is willing to do sufficiently great deeds in order to warrant being sung about, having poems told about your life's work. And this changes, of course, the how people approach living, especially if you are a young, thumatic, energetic, passionate young man who's looking to make your name, looking for respect and honor when you're kind of at the bottom of the totem pole in your tribe. A book I referenced in The Hero and the Man that is not Greek in origin, but which describes this process a little bit, is Chris Kershaw's book, Odin the One-Eyed God, or maybe it's just the One-Eyed God. I have it on my shelf over there somewhere. But it describes how young men in a tribe, and this is not unique to the Nordic world, it just happened to be a book I had at hand that referenced this. And there's a Greek version of this that I address in parallel as well. But they would be taken apart from the tribe, and they would basically conduct raids on nearby towns, and sometimes these raids were not particularly violent. Go steal a few goats or maybe some cows or maybe more. But usually the point was to test each other's valor and courage and cunning and skill and manliness, but also to separate from the women in the tribe from whom you were watched as a child and sort of became a person underneath that. You have to die to that in order to graduate to the next level. But it was also a key part of these initiatory little groups, little raiding teams, as it would, or to become familiar with the heroes of old, to become familiar with the protectors of old, and to begin to embody some of those virtues and character qualities in yourself, to integrate yourself with the sources of value and virtue for your particular tribe. This was the basis of the hero cult practice in not just Proto-Indo-European and Greek world, but much of the rest of the world as well. And of course, you can already see there how the hero is compensated for their sacrifice, for their risk, even if they don't actually die, with being remembered, with being set up as the example for other young men to emulate. And there is honor in that. There's glory in that. What Homer does, fascinatingly, is he doesn't set up this... The stage is set in the Iliad in particular for this immortality to transcend just being remembered and to take wing into something more like the concept of an afterlife that we have inherited in Christianity. There are references to a place called the Island of the Blessed in various Greek texts where heroes can go to rest, and it isn't just Hades. And there's a lot of mystery built into these hero cults as to how a hero can be both here and there, both dead in their burial mound and alive on the Island of the Blessed elsewhere. And Dr. Greg Naj talks at much more length than I am qualified to in his book, The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, which I can't recommend highly enough. He has also dozens of other books on everything ancient Greek hero related. So he's been a phenomenal resource on much of this stuff. But what we see in Homer, in the medium of the poetry itself, is the elevation of the importance of the medium. It's no longer just stories passed around by elders to these young raiding parties, or in the case of the Greeks, passed down by way of drama, passed down by way of dithyrambs and satires in the old sense, not in the modern sense of making fun of things per se, but in the sense of literally being inspired by the satyrs, the goat men associated with Dionysus. And these plays were you had your performers, but you also had a chorus participating in these plays. This is something that Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about extensively in The Birth of Tragedy, his first and, one might say, his most important and his best work. I would say that. I don't think many other people would. But and I'm pretty sure this is an etymological coincidence, but there's actually, the Greeks have their chorus, which is where the young people of the tribe go to reenact, and by reenacting, to participate in the heroic qualities of their past heroes, their ancient heroes, whether that's Agamemnon, like a tragic hero, or someone maybe more noble, like Achilles, or Theseus, or Hercules. They're taking on these roles and performing the same, and the play takes on the same function as the raiding parties of their later northern brethren in Germany and Gaul and so forth. And funnily enough, those raiding parties were, according to Chris Kershaw, called Kordios. At least that's the Proto-Indo-European reconstruction of these small bands of young men learning to embody the heroic qualities of their tribe. However, if heroism can be achieved, the goal of heroism, immortality through the word, can be achieved through the word. If you can become immortal by being remembered through language, in some mysterious way that transcends just other people talking about you, you can actually, in some sense, manifest your essence after death. Heroism, the new aim of heroism, of this kind of immortality, can detach itself from heroic action. It can, in other words, become immortality can lose its role as an incentive for a particular way of being, and can become the new ends desired. And we see this first in Socrates. Now, Socrates was a warrior in his youth, but that's not what he's remembered for. He is remembered primarily for being a philosopher, for being someone who engaged in conversation that he hoped would go on forever, and that he could be a participant in forever, even after death. He famously, in the Apology, which was his defense when he was on trial for, among other things, atheism, and for annoying too many people, essentially, he didn't help his case by comparing himself overtly to Achilles, which is a curious thing to do. The most famous hero in Athens at the time, and the most renowned and the most elevated hero. He compared himself to Achilles and said, after he was sentenced to death, that, well, perhaps death won't be so bad, because I have hopes that I'll be able to talk to these other great men of the past, naming among them Achilles and Odysseus and a few other members of the Trojan War and others. So Socrates did not achieve this, or who knows if he achieved it or not, did not pursue this heroic aim through violent action. He didn't pursue this by attempting to protect Athens from a military threat, or from a dragon, as the classical hero does, going out to slay the dragon. He did it through the word, through logos, or aletheia, as we're about to see, which dovetails directly into the next iteration of Homeric heroism, which is Christianity. There is probably no more potent and powerful example of a post-Homeric hero, or let me rephrase that, an Iliadic, idealistic hero, than Jesus. I mean, think about it at a superficial level. Is there anyone in world history who is more famous, more well-known, has more songs and poems written about them Is there anyone? Is there anyone who has gotten closer, just objectively looking in, to achieving immortality through the word in that way than Jesus? And I mean, whether or not he achieves this, of course, is going to depend a little bit on your religious beliefs. But what makes Christianity interesting is that by all accounts in the New Testament, it seems that Jesus set out with that intention. The word was associated with life, famously in the book of John and elsewhere. The word is the order-giving source and the life-giving source in the biblical worldview, whereas in the Proto-Indo-European world, the world takes shape through sacrifice. Death gives birth to life. Ymir was slain and the world was made from his bones, essentially. But the catch is Homer was not, or did not die this sort of idealist. He didn't hold on to this youthful, heroic idealism, which he described and wrote about in the Iliad, which later transformed and achieved perfection, we could say, in Christianity. He actually backtracked, as we see in the Odyssey, where the protagonist is a man of twists and turns. He's not straightforward in the manner of the Iliadic heroes. And this reflects a difference in his approach to language, which is critical because how can you achieve immortality through words, through song, if the meanings of the words themselves can't be taken directly? And here you have to get into sort of the philosophy of language itself. How does language work? Do words correspond to objects in the world? This is a wall. That is a light. This is a painting. Or is there an inherently subjective aspect of language where the speaker and the hearer are negotiating meaning through sound, wherein one objectively identical word could mean two different things to two different people? And as you come to understand with age and experience, as Odysseus did, the subjective importance of the audience that you are speaking to, the prospect of achieving immortality through the word, through one single story, or through one poem, becomes laughably ridiculous. It becomes an aim not even conceptually possible, because the meanings of those words, however well those words are maintained, will change depending on who is hearing them. And this deeper understanding of language is described by Dr. Greg Nagy as in a way that I've framed, juxtaposed with logos, as ainos. The idea of ainos is that it's often a kind of cryptic mode of speech, but it's oftentimes an elder speaking to a younger person. And what they do is they give some story, or they give some example, or they give some message whose meaning is ambiguous at the time, or maybe a little bit unclear, but which primes the listener to see something in a different way. So in the future, they'll see a cue that brings back to mind the story, and that will be the moment that they understand and know what to do. And it's a higher level approach to communication and to using language and to understanding language, which begins with the assumption that these two people, Dr. Greg Nagy gives three important features of what is necessary for ainos to work. The person has to be intellectually qualified. They have to be able to see the signs and interpret them accurately. And they need to be morally qualified. They need to be noble, agathoi. But third, they need to be mentally connected. They need to actually have a relationship with the person speaking to them. There has to be an interpersonal relationship there, or else there is no possibility of understanding each other. And that's the point that, in a way, 2,000 years after, or 2,600 years after Homer died, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher of language from Austria, came to a very, very similar conclusion. He wrote a book in his youth that he thought would be the last of all philosophical texts, and it had to do with language. And it was that all of language has to function as painting pictures in the head of the listeners. So we have a very objective view of how language works. I describe words that convey images to you, and you interpret those, and we have a clear delineation of how language works and what it is. Done. 20 years later, incidentally, about the same amount of time difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey, he writes a second book, which is published posthumously, where he basically says, actually, that's not quite true. Wittgenstein said language is actually more like a game, or more like sets of games. There's lots of different language games that you can play. And here we're talking about Piagetian games, games that you can create spontaneously with other people, the way that toddlers do with all sorts of toys and so forth. And there's all different language games that you can play. And if one word or one sentence in one linguistic context won't have the same meaning in another linguistic context. And every single person is a different linguistic context. And that's what the Odyssey is about. Contrasted with the hero and the grand, expansive, world-capturing scope of the heroic undertaking of achieving immortality through words that can be understood and will be understood by everyone. Far beyond the hero cults that predated Homer. You have in the Odyssey a man who is, in most cases, trying to not be known. He is trying to hide himself. When confronted with a Cyclops who asks who he is, he says, "My name is Otis, no man." When he finally does return home, he returns in disguise. He is always hiding away from fame and glory, and even in the Iliad we see this in the night raid where Diomedes and Odysseus eventually go out and meet another spy and kill him. Diomedes is told by Agamemnon to choose the best of the Achaeans to join him, and Diomedes chooses Odysseus, and Odysseus rejects the honor. He says, "I'll go with you, but I'm not the best of the Achaeans. Don't call me that." Essentially, always trying to hide away from that, and he is trying to hide away from that so that he can return home, so that he can achieve his nostos, his homecoming. And this is a thing that is denied to Achilles. Achilles is given the choice between immortality, unwilting glory, and a return home. And he eventually, in a moment of rage over Patroclus, opts for glory and sacrifices his homecoming. When Odysseus runs into Achilles again in the underworld, the shade of Achilles says, "I would rather be alive as a slave to a tenant farmer than to be king of the dead." Which is, to tie it back to Christianity in a more positive sense for a moment, a fascinating and beautiful inversion of the line attributed to the devil, to Lucifer. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Exactly the opposite mindset that Achilles, now in the underworld, has. He loved to love life so much, as Nietzsche says, that he would prefer life as a slave to death. So Odysseus seems to already have that wisdom, or has acquired it over the course of the Trojan War. And so his aim is to return home, but he's got quite a few challenges ahead of him. And these challenges are, of course, not purely literal. They are challenges that can be read literally, but as with most high literature, there's a metaphorical dimension to them as well. Challenges regarding marriage, challenges regarding family. And the solution in all of these moments is connection. It is mental connection with especially family, but not exclusively family. And this connection doesn't happen through language necessarily. And that's I think a mistake people might make. They'll think, oh, I just need to talk with these people more. Well, it can't hurt. But the connection that Odysseus has with these people is grounded in experience. And it's actually that experiential connection that makes later communication possible. So it's not like you can establish that that connection bootstrapping yourself up with communication. You need the experience first. One example that comes to mind, and here Odysseus is the recipient of recognition and not the one who's able to give it, but when he is returning home disguised, in disguise. Oh, I should begin with the saddest one, and perhaps the least important, but nonetheless the saddest. When Achilles first gets home, only one person, we'll say, recognizes him. One person. And that was his dog. His dog, which is described as giving like one wag and then dying after noticing his master. That dog had been on countless hunting trips with Odysseus when Odysseus was younger, knew him very well, and it was that you could say that grounding in experience of shared of connection with each other that permitted the dog to recognize his disguised master. Similarly, when Odysseus's old maid Eurycleia is washing this newcomer's feet, she notices a scar on the inside of his thigh that he got hunting in a boar on some island, and she recognized him from that scar. Those shared experiences and knowledge permit communication, or in this case, recognition, which is thematically similar. And of course, there's the example of the bed, where the fact that Odysseus built his bed, one of the bedposts, from a live olive tree, still rooted to the ground, and then built the whole bedroom around this great bed, perfectly planed and skillfully assembled, with a live tree as one of the bedposts. And Penelope asks the servants to move it as a test of this guest to see if he is really Odysseus or is perhaps a god who is trying to trick her in some way. And of course, Odysseus gets very angry, which conveys knowledge, so he is Odysseus, and a god who's all-knowing would not have been surprised by this, so getting angry proves he's not a deity who's trying to trick her. And that past experience, again, permits connection, permits being able to understand each other and to recognize each other. And that recognition ultimately, ironically, leads to Odysseus getting his own epic. He gets the same amount of immortality as Achilles gets, which is to say, not a whole lot, because as the man's interpretation of the language is concerned, these words have no immortalizing power because there's no mental connection with the reader, or at least very, very little. We're doing the best we can with these pretty good translations, but at the end of the day, they are translations of a text from another language in another time that we are very apart from. And yet some of the wisdom that Homer, the writer, the conveyor of this language, is a little bit more universal, because those facts about language are more universal. And I suppose I should take this moment to explain why I'm using the word man as the alternative archetype. The Iliad, in the Iliad, I call this character, this youthful, naive, spirited, and idealistic young man, in a positive sense, a hero, because that is what Homer calls them in the 4th or 5th line. These men who are heroes, who lie dead on the battlefield, a feast for carrion birds and dogs, but the will of Zeus was accomplished. These men who are heroes are chasing something that they don't understand, both in terms of because they don't understand the way that language works. So they're pursuing an immortality that they can't achieve. But they are also perhaps being misled by the language of others. If you are a very idealistic person who identifies words spoken in a corresponding fashion with some external reality, you become very easy to fool, potentially. So someone like Odysseus, who is a little bit more skeptical and who understands words to be a little bit more fluid and a little bit less trustworthy, and who is therefore sometimes inclined to use them a little bit more fluidly, is also less likely to be deceived than someone who is more idealistic. And so Odysseus gets called a man as his archetype. Not that heroes aren't men, but we're talking about a man as a higher archetype that a hero can pass through and aspire to become, because that's what Homer calls him. Andra moi enepe is the opening lines. Man, sing to me of that man of twists and turns, muse, who wandered this way and that countless years, suffering countless pains, and so forth. The man is the one who has this higher understanding of language. He's a little bit more seasoned and a little bit more experienced. And so he can navigate the world, well, as a more skillful pilot, to use a boating metaphor there. And permitting him to come home without being sidetracked by visions of immortality and glory. What's funny is if you read the Odyssey again, if you read the passage on the sirens in particular, the sirens are offering to sing to him about Troy. They're offering to sing to him about himself. They are offering heroic immortalization. And it's a very sweet song that draws many men to their death on the rocks, much as it did on the plains of Troy. So there's a pattern here that we see repeated in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The only difference is its desirability. Now, am I, in this book, The Hero and the Man, saying that being a hero is bad? No. I believe that going through a heroic phase, much as it was with the Koros and the Kordios of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the Greeks, is a necessary phase. You can't become an Odysseus, a man, unless you have passed through the heroic phase, unless you have truly accepted the values described in words of your society as yours and trying to live up to them in an idealistic fashion. But there comes a point where you notice, perhaps, that perhaps your society is hypocritical. Perhaps it doesn't live up to its own stated standards, to the words of its ideals. And it can be very easy to become disillusioned by the inconsistency, the apparent inconsistency between the words that people say and the things that they actually do. This is captured in a character named Thersites. Very briefly, very, very momentary appearance in the Iliad, but very understated in importance. And he is a railer. He just verbally abuses people. That's his thing. He does it for laughter. So he has a comedic quality to him. He tries to make fun of people, like a stand-up comedian, just making fun of people today. But what all of his criticisms seem to be just pointing out hypocrisy. And everyone kind of hates him. They laugh at him, but they also hate him. And the hypocrisy is sort of a window into the heart of someone who has been disillusioned, who maybe held those values, but just got so let down by the inconsistency. Here's this great king who's acting like a child. Here's this great man who's chasing after a woman. He can't even defend himself, blah, blah, blah. It's all pointing out hypocrisy as a way to attack the world around you. And this, I think, is a moment that will come to every idealistic young man who has truly embraced values in an absolute fashion, and comes to see that the people who first promulgated those values to him, from whom he learned them, don't hold them in an absolute sense. Sometimes they don't seem to hold them at all. This was certainly my experience when it came to things like freedom of speech. And so the hero who has reached this moment has a choice, basically. They can fall down the path of disillusionment in the direction of Thersites, or they can learn from the man, learn the true way that language works, which is not as direct and literal and linear as heroic idealists and Christians and Hegelians. I won't go into that here. There's a big section on Hegel in this book that I tried to make accessible, so you don't have to read the original German or anything crazy like that. But it's easy to become disillusioned if you take language literally. But with this higher understanding of how language works, suddenly it becomes clear that, these words that people in my society use to convey these values to me were trying to move me in a direction. Perfect communication wasn't even possible yet because I wasn't mentally connected with my own society. But after having passed through the heroic phase, the heroic, youthful, idealistic period, participating in the choreos or the chorus, and going and either reenacting or literally participating in the lives of Achilles and the other great heroes of the past. Only then can I have the mental connection to understand what my society was trying to tell me, which is not that, for example, in my case, speech should be absolutely free, absolutely, or let the sky fall, as the Romans might say. But it is more directional. It is more about conveying a certain way of living that values free speech, but not to conflate a stated value with an absolute, like some sort of naive idealist. Because human beings are just as complex as our language is, if not more so. And we are not linear, single-minded beings. that's a recipe for disaster. Dare we say heroic disaster, which is, of course, the subject of Homer's first book. And man, I think that's all I have to say by way of an intro. I've pretty much given away half the book at this point. But I would like to say it's still worth buying, if and in large part for Suerin's absolutely fantastic artwork. Or for those who are just joining in, this is an example, the original inking that's on the cover. So, oh man, we've got 7 now. Does anyone have any questions or ideas? I'm seeing those who don't glow don't need the spotlight. True. Very true. People who, and conversely, people who go for the spotlight might glow. Or they might not. If I glowed, I would be trying to avoid the spotlight. Isn't that how you would go about it? I don't know. Well, does anyone have any questions or comments? I suppose I should mention, if you are going to read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I hope the main effect of my book is to encourage people to read Homer, and the Fagel's translations are excellent. They're truly phenomenal. Not the only good ones, but they're pretty good. But I'd also like to, I hope the effect my book has is to explain why Homer is so worth reading. In fact, let me just jump through and read the first part of chapter 1 here for you. A little bit of free reading. So chapter 1, for those who are listening, is called Homer, Heart of the West. All of Western civilization flows from the words of Homer. His epic stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, shaped the stories, art, and thought of Greek culture and all subsequent cultures that sprang from the Greek foundation. Homer's stories united all of Greece as Greece. Homer defined what it meant to be Greek, and Greece ultimately built the Western world. We can see it in our architecture and our language. In fact, architecture is Greek in origin, stemming from archi, meaning first, who commands, and tekton, meaning builder. Less visible, but no less present, is the Greek influence on our philosophy and religion. Homer gave birth to our aesthetic ideals, especially our ideals regarding how men ought to be. It would behoove the Western man, then, perhaps in pursuit of Socrates' advice to know thyself, to come to understand Homer. Among writers, poets, classicists, and theologians, this opinion about the influence of Homer is not much debated, but taken as a kind of given. Yet the precise nature of this influence seems less clear. Critics praise different aspects of his significance: his clarity, his energy, his directness and objectivity, the beauty of his depictions, the moral values conveyed in his stories, or simply his longevity. Quote, and here I have like 7 quotes or something. Quote, "The first teacher and beginner of all these beauties of tragedy," is Plato on Homer. Homer's poems were writ from a free fury, an absolute and full soul. Virgil's out of a courtly, laborious, and altogether imitatory spirit. Not a simile he hath, but is Homer's. Not an invention, person, or disposition, but is wholly or originally built upon Homerical foundations. And in many places hath the very words Homer useth. All Homer's books are such as have been precedents ever since of all sorts of poems, imitating none, nor ever worthily imitated of any. George Chapman, 1598. But when to examine every part he came, nature and Homer were, he found, the same. Alexander Pope. But what lies as the womb of the Hellenic behind the Homeric world? In the latter, by the extremely artistic definiteness and the calm and purity of the lines, we are already lifted far above the purely material amalgamation. Its colors, by an artistic deception, appear lighter, milder, warmer. Its men, in this colored, warm illumination, appear better and more sympathetic. But where do we look if no longer guided and protected by Homer's hand? We step backward into the pre-Homeric world. Only the night and horror, into the products of a fancy accustomed to the horrible. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1872. So Homer lifted them out of the darkness. It was Homer who gave laws to the artist. It was Homer who inspired the poet. Francis Wayland, 1922. But anyhow, it is true that this, which is our first poem, might very well be our last poem too. It might well be the last word as well as the first word spoken by man about his mortal lot as seen by merely mortal vision. If the world becomes pagan and perishes, the last man left alive would do well to quote the Iliad and die. G.K. Chesterton, 1925. And one more. It is hardly possible to overestimate the importance for Western literature of the Iliad's demonstration that the fall of an enemy, no less than of a friend or leader, is tragic and not comic. With the Iliad, once for all, an objective and disinterested element enters into the poet's vision of human life. Without this element, poetry is merely instrumental to various social aims, to propaganda, to amusement, to devotion, to instruction. With it, it acquires the authority that since the Iliad it has never lost, an authority based, like the authority of science, on the vision of nature as an impersonal order. Northrop Frye, 1957. And I think I'll stop there. That's about a third of the way through chapter 1. But it was that initial idea that Homer has been so influential in our culture in so many different ways that it would almost be a failure to know yourself, to understand yourself and your own context, to not be familiar with the source text. And of course, should go without saying that that is also a reason to read the Bible, even if you are not a Christian. But I would say it's also a reason for Christians and non-Christians alike to read Homer and to familiarize yourself with the Iliad and the Odyssey. Not merely for their enjoyment, which they provide more and more of as you come to understand the texts better and better, but also for the real wisdom that they can carry for young men, for old men, for marriage and friendship, and for hopefully living a good life that you don't regret. And with that, I think I'll call it quits here. Does anyone have any final comments, questions? Where can I buy this wonderful book? When is the hardcover coming? Don't know that yet, but we will be working on that, as well as an audio version, which I've been promising to everyone else about In Defense of Hatred and not delivered, but that will be coming too as well. Not soon, but it will be coming. Anyways, that's enough of that. So, pleasure chatting and have a good evening, everyone.